Officer Elena Cruz had driven the same night route 100 times, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the unusually heavy fog rolling off the Hudson, or the silence that settled over the city like a held breath. Seated beside her, Officer Dana Moretti adjusted the dial on the police radio, frowning as static hissed through the speakers. Midnight shifts in lower Manhattan could swing from dead quiet to deadly chaos in seconds, but tonight there was nothing. No chatter, no drunk college kids, no sirens. Just the drone of tires on wet pavement and the soft rhythm of windshield wipers. Cruz tapped the steering wheel and said, "Let's take the tunnel. Cut through faster." Moretti glanced over. "Holland? Thought they were doing late-night work?" Cruz shrugged. "Dot said they finished yesterday. It's open. Let's move." The tunnel entrance yawned ahead, a curved mouth carved beneath the city, lined with sodium lights that hummed like tired insects. As they drove in, the walls closed in around them, grime-streaked tile, water stains, and that damp, metallic smell that never left. The tunnel was usually a blur of movement and noise, but now it felt like a tomb. There were no other cars, no pedestrians, just the cruiser and the hollow echo of their own engine. A long, uneasy silence stretched between them. "You feel that?" Moretti finally asked. Cruz nodded slowly. "Yeah, like something's off." Neither said the word they were both thinking: haunted. The first mile passed in eerie quiet. Then the lights began to flicker. Not a simple surge, but a pattern like Morse code played by unseen hands. The beams would shiver, dim, then flash again. Cruz slowed the cruiser. "That's not a wiring issue," she muttered. "You think someone's down here messing with the grid?" Moretti scanned the walls, her hand resting lightly on her holstered sidearm. "Could be, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Neither wanted to voice the creeping dread curling into their chests. Their radios crackled to life, then died again. The signal bars blinked out. No dispatch, no GPS, nothing but static. Cruz tapped the dash in frustration. "Dead zone?" Moretti turned her head toward the passenger window. "There's no dead zone this deep unless—" Her voice caught. "Stop the car." Cruz slammed the brakes. The tires screeched against the damp asphalt, and both women stared ahead. There, just past the next curve in the tunnel, stood a figure. Alone, motionless. A woman, dressed in flowing garments that shimmered faintly even in the flickering gloom. Her face was obscured by a pale blue veil, and her hands were folded across her chest. Cruz's voice dropped to a whisper. "Is that a nun?" But even as she asked it, something inside her screamed that this was no ordinary person. They hadn't passed anyone. No vehicle had entered behind them. Yet here she was, still as stone, silent as prayer. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. But the air grew colder with every second they watched her. And deep in the tunnel, something had begun to hum, low, steady, and unnatural. It pressed against their eardrums like pressure from beneath the earth. Moretti's hand tightened around her holster. "This isn't right. None of this is right." And yet neither of them could look away. Cruz's fingers hovered above the gear shift as her foot stayed frozen on the brake. Every instinct told her to back out, flip the cruiser around, and leave that tunnel behind for good. But she didn't move. Neither did Moretti. The figure stood completely still, just beyond the curve, as if waiting for something or someone. "Should we call it in?" Cruz whispered. Moretti shook her head slowly. "Radio's dead, and even if it wasn't, who are we going to call this into? Central, we've got a ghost in the tunnel?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Neither of them laughed. Then the tunnel lights began to flicker again, but this time it wasn't just the ceiling bulbs. The headlights of the cruiser dimmed and pulsed in rhythm with the overhead glow. For a brief second, the tunnel plunged into near-total darkness. Cruz's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale. When the lights flicked back on, the woman was closer. Just a few feet now. No footsteps, no movement, just closer. Cruz slammed the car into reverse without thinking. The tires squealed as they backed up several feet, but the woman didn't follow. She simply stood there, hands still folded, robe unmoving in the still air. "You saw that, right?" Moretti asked, eyes wide. She moved. She moved, but she didn't walk. Cruz nodded silently, heart hammering in her chest. They had both been on the force long enough to know what real fear felt like: gunpoint fear, domestic call fear, undercover drug bust fear. This was different. This was primal. The hum grew louder. It wasn't coming from the engine. It wasn't feedback from the radio. It was everywhere, like the tunnel itself was vibrating, as though something beneath their tires had come awake. Moretti turned and glanced behind them. Still no other cars. No workers. No backup. They were alone. "Elena," she said carefully, "turn off the lights." Cruz looked at her like she was insane. "Do it," Moretti insisted. Just for a second, the headlights died. The overhead bulbs dimmed, but didn't go out completely. In that moment, the tunnel seemed to breathe, and the woman glowed. Not harshly, not like neon or spotlight. It was more like the glow of moonlight on water. Soft, reverent, beautiful in a way that didn't make sense. And though they couldn't see her face beneath the veil, both officers felt it. She was looking right at them, seeing through them, into them. Cruz's voice shook. "That's not a person." Moretti didn't respond. Her eyes were locked forward, lips parted in awe. And then something happened that neither of them could explain for the rest of their lives. The dashboard crucifix, an old metal one Cruz had zip-tied beside the center console, began to swing, though the car hadn't moved. It turned slightly, pointing toward the woman. Then it stopped, frozen midair, like caught in invisible thread. "I think we're supposed to get out," Moretti murmured. "No way," Cruz replied, barely audible. "No. We stay here. We wait. We—" Then the lights went out again. But this time, they didn't come back on. The tunnel was swallowed in darkness, so complete it felt alive. Cruz blinked rapidly, hoping her eyes would adjust, but there was nothing to adjust to. Just pitch-black silence pressing in from every side. She reached for the flashlight clipped to her vest with shaking hands, the plastic clicking louder than it should have in the cruiser's cab. She flicked it on. Nothing. The beam was weak, dimmer than it had any right to be. Batteries full, bulb new, but it sputtered like a candle in the wind. Moretti opened the passenger door. "What are you doing?" Cruz hissed. "We stay in the car." But Moretti didn't answer. She had already stepped out, her boots hitting the damp concrete with a hollow echo. She moved toward the front of the vehicle, her own flashlight in hand, sweeping it forward in slow arcs. The darkness seemed to resist it, swallowing the beam before it could stretch more than a few feet. Cruz cursed under her breath and stepped out to follow. The hum was stronger now, pulsing in her chest like a second heartbeat. Her skin tingled. The air was thick, heavy, like they were moving through water instead of air. Then, as their flashlights passed over the tunnel wall ahead, the woman appeared again. She hadn't walked. She hadn't emerged. She was simply there, as if she had always been standing in that spot, waiting for them to arrive. Her veil draped to the floor, pale blue like summer sky. Her robes shimmered faintly, impossibly clean against the grime-covered walls. Her hands were still folded, fingers loose and relaxed, not clenched like a statue. And though her face remained hidden, Cruz felt warmth radiating from her. Not heat warmth, the kind that lives in memory, the kind that makes your eyes sting and your knees go weak. Neither officer moved. Neither spoke. The hum faded, replaced by a stillness so intense it roared in their ears. Cruz's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" she whispered. No response. Not a sound. Not even the usual tunnel drips. The woman didn't blink, didn't breathe. Yet it didn't feel like death. It felt like presence. Like something ancient had stepped into their world for a moment and paused just long enough for them to notice. Moretti took a step forward, then another. "Ma'am?" she said, voice wavering. "Do you need assistance?" Her training fought with her instincts, but her instincts were winning. She lowered the flashlight slightly and let her free hand open, no threat, no aggression. The air shifted. The woman slowly lifted one arm, graceful as wind over grass, and extended a single finger toward them. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. A soft glow spilled from her fingertips, barely lighting the tunnel floor. For the first time, Cruz noticed something etched into the wall behind her words. Maybe? Symbols? But she couldn't make them out. Her flashlight refused to reach that far, even when she aimed it directly. It was as if light itself bent around the woman, unwilling to intrude. Then, without warning, the glow vanished. The woman lowered her hand and folded it back beneath the other. Her head tilted slightly. And in that moment, both officers felt something impossible. A voice inside their chests, not spoken, not heard, but felt. You are seen, and then the darkness collapsed into light. The tunnel lights blazed to life in an instant, nearly blinding after so much darkness. Cruz and Moretti both staggered backward, instinctively shielding their eyes. When their vision cleared, they looked to where the woman had stood, but she was gone. Nothing but damp pavement and that same grimy tile wall remained. No shimmer, no glow, just silence and the lingering echo of a heartbeat that didn't feel like their own. For a full second, neither spoke. Then Cruz reached for her weapon. Her fingers gripped the cold metal grip of her Glock like a lifeline. Gun? Moretti asked sharply. Seriously? Cruz's voice was tight. You saw her. You heard something. You tell me that wasn't real. Moretti didn't argue. She pulled her own sidearm and nodded once. We moved together. Tight. They stepped forward side by side, slowly approaching the spot where the figure had just stood. The wall looked completely normal, just the same soot-stained, water-streaked ceramic tile that had lined the tunnel for decades. But something about it still felt wrong. The air was different here, warmer, as if the air hadn't caught up with the reality around it. Their flashlights flicked back to full brightness now, suddenly working just fine. The glow from Cruz's beam passed over the wall and she froze. Wait. She crouched and held the light low. Moretti stepped beside her, peering down at the concrete. That's when they both saw it. A faint outline of ash in the shape of two bare feet. Not shoe prints, bare feet. Slender, narrow, and perfectly still. And they hadn't been there before. This doesn't make sense, Moretti muttered. She was veiled, fully covered. No exposed feet. She wasn't barefoot. Cruz's jaw clenched. Then how are these here? Suddenly, the tunnel shook. A deep rumble rolled beneath their boots, like the belly of a beast shifting in its sleep. The cruiser's headlights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a deep, metallic groan echoed a sound like twisting steel and snapping cables. Cruz stood. Something's happening. We need to. Her words were cut off by the screech of tires and the roar of an engine. A truck. A big one. Barreling toward them from the far end of the tunnel. Move! Moretti shouted. They dove for the median, just in time to see a massive 18-wheeler scream past, its driver clearly trying to brake but swerving uncontrollably. Then impact. A second vehicle slammed into the rear of the truck. The trailer jackknifed violently. Sparks exploded along the walls. Steel screamed against concrete. The force of the crash sent a shockwave through the tunnel, knocking both officers flat against the barrier. The semi's back end tilted, buckling the ceiling above it. Chunks of tile and rebar rained down as the tunnel partially collapsed, right where their cruiser had been parked only moments before. Dust choked the air. Emergency lights finally triggered. Red strobes painted the carnage in surreal pulses. Cruz coughed, ears ringing, trying to sit up. Dana, she rasped. Moretti was already pushing herself upright, dazed but alert. They looked at each other, eyes wide with the same realization. If they hadn't stopped for that woman, they'd be dead. Moretti was the first to say it out loud. She saved us. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, mixing with the blinking red of emergency tunnel lights. Sirens screamed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Cruz and Moretti sat against the wall, backs pressed to the cool tile, hands still trembling. The semi-truck was folded into itself, wedged across two lanes, trailer jackknifed in a way no driver could have survived. Their cruiser was gone, flattened beneath the collapse. Debris still rained in slow intervals from the weakened ceiling, but the structure had mostly stabilized. Somehow, they had walked away without a scratch. Cruz pulled her knees up and stared ahead, her voice barely audible. Why us? Moretti didn't answer immediately. She was staring toward the spot where the woman had stood. I don't think she spoke with a voice, she said after a moment. I think she was the voice. Cruz turned slowly. What do you mean? Moretti hesitated, then said, I didn't hear her speak, but something was said, or felt, right before the light came back. You heard it too, didn't you? Cruz swallowed hard. Yeah, you are seen. The words hadn't echoed. They hadn't rung out like sound. They had pulsed deep in the chest, like a second heartbeat. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. Both women had seen death before. They'd watched people die, some in the line of duty, some because they weren't fast enough, or lucky enough, or smart enough. But tonight they had been spared in a way that defied logic. Cruz touched her chest instinctively, brushing the spot where the feeling had originated. She wasn't warning us, she said quietly. She was. Acknowledging us. Like she knew what was coming. Moretti nodded slowly, still staring into the settling dust. First responders arrived within minutes. Firefighters flooded the scene, assessing the structural integrity of the tunnel. EMTs tried to check the officers for injuries, but they waved them off. Both were fine, more than fine, physically untouched but inwardly shaken. An FDNY captain approached. "How the hell did you make it out of that alive?" he asked. Cruz looked at Moretti, unsure how to answer. "We stopped," she said eventually. "Saw someone in the tunnel, got out of the car." The captain frowned. "You saw someone? A worker? A pedestrian?" Cruz hesitated. "A woman," she replied. "We don't know who she was." Later, at the precinct, they sat in the break room, sipping burnt coffee in silence. Neither had said what they were really thinking, that they had seen something sacred, something beyond training manuals or crime reports. It wasn't just a miracle of timing, it was a miracle of intervention. Someone had stepped in, someone had warned them without words. A presence that could bend time, collapse space, and guide fate in a way neither could explain. They didn't know if it was the Virgin Mary, or a spirit, or something older than any name they knew. But they knew what they saw, and they knew what they felt. Moretti finally broke the silence. "You think anybody's going to believe us?" Cruz looked down at her cup. "Not a chance." By the time the tunnel was fully cleared, the entire city was buzzing. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the aftermath of the collapse. Reporters gathered at the mouth of the tunnel like vultures, shoving mics toward anyone in uniform. The story was already spinning. A freak accident, driver fatigue, a mechanical failure, some combination of all three. But the miracle that two officers had been parked directly where the semi had crashed, and somehow weren't there when it happened, was already being whispered through the precinct halls. Cruz and Moretti gave their official statements, careful to stay within the lines. They mentioned spotting an unidentified female figure in the tunnel, possibly distressed, prompting them to exit their vehicle. They didn't mention the veil. They didn't mention the glow. They certainly didn't mention the voice that spoke without sound or the fact that the woman had moved without moving. They kept it clean, credible, just enough to explain why they'd left their cruiser moments before it was crushed into a pancake. But deep down, both women were haunted by the same realization. The moment they blinked, the woman was gone. Not like someone turning a corner or slipping out of view. She had simply ceased to exist, as if she had never been there in the first place. And yet, the moment she disappeared, the truck had appeared, as if her job was done, as if she had held the moment back until they were safe. The following day, Cruz drove to the tunnel alone. She parked just outside the barriers, where construction crews were still tearing down damaged concrete and hauling away debris. She showed her badge and was waved past the checkpoint without question. The tunnel was closed, but she didn't need to go far. She just wanted to stand where it had happened. She walked the length slowly, boots echoing over the still dusty asphalt, eyes scanning the walls like a pilgrim looking for signs. But there was nothing. No woman in blue. No scorched marks. No ethereal glow. No soft whisper in her chest. Just a long, lifeless stretch of urban engineering, stripped of any sign that something divine had passed through. The space felt smaller now, hollow, like the presence had been sucked out and sealed behind invisible glass. She stood where the feet had been, nothing remained, not even the ash. Later, she met Moretti at a diner in Hell's Kitchen. They sat at the booth in silence for a long while, sipping black coffee and avoiding the topic until Cruz finally broke the tension. "You know what gets me?" she said. "If we hadn't seen her, we wouldn't have stopped." Moretti nodded. "If we hadn't stopped, we'd be dead." Cruz looked out the window, the city buzzing by as if the world hadn't nearly tilted off its axis. "She wasn't trying to scare us," she said. "She didn't even try to get our attention. She was just there." Moretti's voice was low. And then she wasn't. The official report called it a low-visibility structural collision. The truck driver had swerved too late, reacting to a stalled car that never showed up in the footage. The impact tore through support columns already weakened by time and erosion. It was all logical on paper. The engineers signed off on the failure points. The Transportation Authority held a press conference, full of apologies and promises of inspections. The city moved on like it always did. But Cruz couldn't stop replaying the moment. She remembered how their cruiser had coasted to a halt, right beneath that failing beam. How they'd gotten out because of her. Because something about the woman had frozen them in place, not in fear, but in stillness. If they'd been even 10 feet ahead, if they'd taken one more second before exiting, if they'd hesitated, that ceiling would have dropped directly on them. The steel slab had crushed the front of the cruiser like a tin can. Their names would have been added to the NYPD wall, two more in a long list of fallen officers. Moretti stood at the tunnel entrance 3 days later, watching crews remove what was left of the semi. It had taken a fleet of cranes and multiple nights to carefully dismantle what remained. The cab was unrecognizable, and the driver had died on impact. No foul play, no substances, just a freak accident. She stood quietly as a firefighter beside her muttered, "It's a miracle nobody else got hurt." She didn't respond. He wouldn't understand. Not without seeing her. The woman in blue. Inside the precinct, whispers continued. A few officers had started calling it the ghost tunnel. Some claimed they'd heard similar stories years ago. An old beat cop who once swore he'd seen candles flickering in the alcoves down there, though there weren't supposed to be alcoves at all. Urban legends spread fast, especially when they weren't easily dismissed. But no one brought it up in the official briefings. No one dared write it in ink. Cruz pulled the surveillance footage herself. She needed to see it again, needed confirmation. But when she opened the file, her stomach dropped. The footage from their patrol car's dashcam was corrupted digital noise and static bars, warping the image beyond recognition. Body cams, blank. Tunnel traffic cameras. The files existed, but the critical 5-minute window had been mysteriously scrubbed clean. Everything leading up to the moment was normal. Everything after? Static. She leaned back in her chair, tension coiled in her shoulders. "How does every camera go dead at the same time?" she muttered. Moretti, sitting nearby, looked up from her own screen. "I've seen glitchy feeds before, 1 or 2 cameras, maybe an audio dropout, but all of them?" She shook her head. "Someone's either covering it up or—" Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Cruz already knew. The collapse hadn't just been an accident, it had been timed. Down to the second. And only one thing had stood between them and death. The woman who wasn't supposed to be there, who left no footprints, and who disappeared the moment they were safe. A miracle that arrived without fanfare, then vanished before the world could ask why. The conference room at the precinct was cold, clinical, and stiflingly quiet. Cruz and Moretti sat side by side across from 2 internal affairs officers and their precinct captain. No cameras. Just notepads, a recorder on the table, and 4 people pretending not to dance around the truth. The questions came slow and calculated. What made you exit your vehicle? Did you see any obstruction in the tunnel? Were you responding to a civilian? At what point did the camera stop recording? Moretti answered the way she was supposed to. There was a figure in the tunnel, a woman, unknown, standing still in the middle of the roadway. We exited the vehicle to make contact. Before we could reach her, the crash occurred. That was the official story. That was what would go in the file. But Cruz could tell from the IA agents' expressions that something was off. They weren't just taking statements, they were measuring tone, cross-checking pauses, watching too closely. One of them leaned forward. "You say the woman disappeared. Do you mean she fled the scene?" Cruz met his gaze. "No. I mean we turned away for a second, and she was gone. No trace, no sign of her anywhere in the tunnel afterward." The agent clicked his pen slowly, then scribbled something down. Another spoke next. "The cameras show only static from 2:12 to 2:17 a.m. All tunnel cams, dash cams, and body cams simultaneously lost footage during that window. Can either of you explain that?" Cruz didn't blink. "No, sir. We can't." There was a pause. Then the captain cleared his throat. "Well, ladies, the department appreciates your cooperation. And we're all grateful you made it out alive. This could have been much worse." His tone was warm, but something in his eyes had gone cold. Final. The message was clear. This conversation is over. Outside, the hallway buzzed with life again. Phones ringing, footsteps echoing, radios crackling with dispatch calls. But Cruz and Moretti felt like ghosts drifting through it all. "They don't want us asking questions," Cruz said under her breath. Moretti nodded. "They already have an answer. Driver lost control. Officers survived due to quick instincts. Clean story, no need to complicate it." Cruz turned toward her. Or they know more than they're saying. M. Later that evening, their supervisor quietly handed them both copies of the final report. Cruz flipped through hers page by page. It was polished, tidy, and entirely incomplete. The section describing the woman in the tunnel had been reduced to a single vague line. Unidentified figure possibly caused officers to exit vehicle moments before crash. No mention of a veil. No mention of the light. No, you are seen. That line in the report hit Moretti hard. Possibly, she muttered. We saw her. Cruz folded the report shut. They made it a footnote, like she was an afterthought, like none of it mattered. The truth had been buried beneath bureaucracy, filed away, boxed up, forgotten, but neither of them could forget. Not the stillness, not the glow, not the way the tunnel felt when she was there. It didn't matter if no one else believed them. She had been real. And someone, somewhere, wanted to make sure no one ever found out. The next morning, Cruz sat at her desk long before the sun rose, replaying every frame of corrupted footage. She had seen body cam glitches before, buffering issues, battery failures, even the occasional electromagnetic spike that fried a card. But this was different. The tunnel incident hadn't been filmed in one place. It had been captured from 4 different angles across multiple systems: their cruiser dash cam, their 2 chest cams, and the central traffic surveillance grid. All had gone dark at the same moment. All had restarted exactly 5 minutes later. 5 minutes, clean, surgical, like someone had pressed delete not after the fact, but during the moment itself. Moretti walked in and dropped a paper bag on the desk. Black coffee, extra sugar. Cruz barely looked up. You checked the precinct server? Moretti nodded. Same thing. Backup drives? Empty during that window. Local drive, cloud sync, traffic control logs gone. She dropped into the chair across from her and leaned in, lowering her voice. It's not just the footage. I ran into Torres from Highway Division. He said he was pulled into a technical review meeting with the city's Department of Transportation and someone from Homeland Security. Cruz blinked. Homeland Security? Moretti nodded slowly. They didn't ask questions. They gave instructions. No footage is to be reviewed without clearance. Nothing gets released. No inquiries allowed about the tunnel during the crash window. No mention of any unexplained person on scene. His words, we don't chase ghosts. Cruz exhaled hard and sat back. They're scrubbing it. They already scrubbed it, Moretti replied. Cruz turned back to her screen and paused the static at a frame where the tunnel's lights had just begun to flicker. The timestamp was 2:11:53. 1 second before the light went out. 1 second before everything changed. She stared at the grainy image, trying to will the woman's figure into being. But it wasn't there. There was nothing. Just blurry tiles and the blurred shine of headlights until everything went black. Later that day, they checked the scene again. Officially, the tunnel was still under reconstruction, but Cruz had pulled a favor from a friend in traffic logistics to get temporary access while no crews were working. The tunnel felt different now, colder, somehow smaller. The sounds of traffic above no longer rumbled down into the space like they used to. As they walked the stretch where their cruiser had been crushed, Cruz slowed to a stop. Her flashlight scanned the walls. Nothing, just gray and grime. Then Moretti saw it first. Low on the wall, almost level with her knees, was a strange smear. Not graffiti, not soot, a burn mark. The outline was faint but distinct. It wasn't shaped like words or a tag. It was shaped like arms. 2 open arms curved gently outward, as if waiting to embrace something. Or someone. Neither spoke. There was no scorch pattern anywhere else. No residue. Just that one mark, faint and warm to the touch. Moretti pulled out her phone and took a photo. They can delete files. They can lock reports. But they can't erase this. Cruz touched the burn mark with her fingers. It felt like standing next to an old church candle, residual warmth, long after the flame had died. She was here, Cruz whispered. She was here. And now, she had left something behind. The tunnel wall stayed with Cruz. Not just the shape scorched into it, but the memory of what had been hanging against that woman's robe. In the moment, she hadn't been fully aware of it. It was like a detail from a dream, half buried, half clear. But now that she'd seen that mark on the wall, the image of the woman was coming back into focus. Not her face, never her face. That had remained veiled. But her chest, just above where her hands had been folded, something had glinted softly. Not from the tunnel light, but from some inner glow. A metal. Cruz sat in her apartment with the overhead lights off, staring at her laptop screen. She had searched everything she could. Marian symbols, nun orders, saints' relics, religious metals used around the world. At first, it all blurred together: standard crucifixes, sacred heart tokens, miraculous metals. But none of them looked quite right. Then, after hours of scrolling through obscure Catholic relic archives and forgotten European symbols, she froze. There it was. A small oval medal, slightly larger than a thumbprint. On one side, the image of the Virgin Mary with arms extended downward, rays of light pouring from her hands. On the other, 12 stars encircling a letter, M, intertwined with a cross, flanked by two hearts, one crowned in thorns, the other pierced by a sword. The medal of the Immaculate Conception, also known as the miraculous medal. But this version was different: older, weathered, hand-pressed bronze. Not silver, not gold, not mass-produced. The listing was from a Vatican collection site. The caption read, "Rare wartime variant issued to underground Christian resistance members during the Second World War. Believed to be blessed by clergy operating in occupied Europe. Rumored to offer protection from evil in hidden places." Cruz leaned back, heart thudding. She was wearing this. She was sure of it now. Not a copy, not a modern necklace. The original. The same style, the same symbols, the same worn edge. She hadn't recognized it in the moment because it hadn't made sense. It didn't belong to their world anymore. The next day, she brought the image to Moretti. They sat in the back corner of a quiet cathedral in Midtown, one of the few places they felt safe from prying ears. Cruz passed her the phone. "That's it," Moretti said immediately. "That's what she had on. I thought it was just a pendant, but this is exactly it." She read the description. "Resistance era, underground use, blessed for protection." Cruz whispered, "Protection, in dark places." The tunnel, the light, the impossible timing. It wasn't just a random appearance. It was placement, a warning and a shield. They both sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the city muffled behind stained glass and candlelight. Around them, a few parishioners knelt in quiet prayer. One old man clutched a rosary so tightly it shook in his fingers. A woman lit a candle beneath a statue of Mary, tears in her eyes. The sacred was still alive, even here in a city that had long stopped noticing. Moretti looked up at the Virgin statue. "You think that was her? The real thing?" Cruz didn't answer right away. She studied the features of the statue, the calm gaze, the open hands, the veil. Then she said, "I think whoever she didn't want to be worshipped. She just wanted us alive." The medal had been her signature. A small, deliberate echo from a time when faith had to survive underground. And now, she had resurfaced just long enough to remind them, "You are seen. You are protected." It had been nearly 2 weeks since the collapse, but Cruz couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The city had moved on. The tunnel had reopened to limited traffic under a temporary support structure, and public interest had shifted to the next crisis. But for Cruz and Moretti, the silence that followed the miracle felt louder than the miracle itself. The burn mark, the missing footage, the metal, all clues leading nowhere, or maybe leading back. They didn't tell anyone they were returning. No paperwork, no dispatch call, just two plainclothes officers taking a drive during their off hours. The cruiser was parked discreetly just beyond the reconstruction barricades, and they walked in on foot, flashlights tucked into their coats like tools from another life. The hum was gone now. That low vibration they'd once felt in their bones had disappeared. The tunnel was still, empty, but it was not quiet. There was a kind of anticipation in the air, an invisible pressure, like the weight of memory thickening the atmosphere. Cruz stopped at the spot where the woman had first appeared. It looked ordinary now, forgettable. A stretch of tile indistinguishable from any other. She stared at it for a long time. "This is where she was, right here." Moretti stood beside her. "And this is where we stopped, where we got out." They turned together, their bodies instinctively replaying the positions, as if reliving it might unlock the truth they'd missed the first time. Cruz pulled a small votive candle from her coat pocket. She hadn't told Moretti she'd brought it. She wasn't even sure why she had. Maybe it was guilt, maybe gratitude. Or maybe it was just her body remembering a gesture her soul hadn't yet understood. She crouched low and placed it on the ground, just beneath the wall where the scorched outline had appeared. She lit it with her Zippo, shielding the flame from the breeze, and watched it flicker into life. For a long time, they stood in silence, letting the flame do what it was meant to do. Then Moretti moved a few steps down the tunnel. Her light caught something on the floor, a reflection. She crouched. "Cruz, come look at this." Cruz walked over and saw it immediately. A tiny object embedded in the grime between tiles. Metallic, flat, round. She picked it up with gloved hands. It was a medal. Not bronze like the one from the archive photo, but dull silver. A small M intertwined with a cross. The same 12 stars. The same 2 hearts. Slightly tarnished, but unmistakably the same design. The back of it had been etched crudely, by hand. 2 letters. E.C. Cruz froze. That's me." Her breath caught. She turned it over again, heart pounding. "How did this?" Moretti looked at her. "You didn't drop this?" Cruz shook her head. "I've never owned one. Not like this." She closed her fingers around it slowly. It was warm to the touch. Not hot, just alive. Like it had been waiting for her. They stared at each other, both understanding what had just happened without needing to say it aloud. The woman hadn't just appeared to save them. She'd left them something. A message. A marker. A reason to come back. And now that they had, she had answered. The medal still rested in Cruz's hand when they returned to the place where the first scorch mark had appeared. She knelt carefully, brushing the concrete with her fingertips. Dust clung to the skin, but there was no mistaking the outline now. The arms were still there, subtle, faded, but persistent, as if whatever had left them behind wasn't done speaking. This time, the mark was different. It had grown. What was once just the curve of 2 arms had extended upward into faint outlines, shoulders, a suggestion of a bowed head, the beginnings of a veil. Still too faint to photograph clearly, but not imagination. Not a trick of shadows. It was a figure now. Gentle. Open. Etched into the very structure of the tunnel itself. Moretti stood behind Cruz, arms crossed, heart pounding. "Did we miss this before?" Cruz shook her head. "No. This wasn't here, or at least, not like this." She turned back and stared at the wall. "It's deepening. Like it's being drawn slowly. Like she's coming into focus." They took out their phones and tried photographing it, but the images didn't do it justice. The burn marks only showed up clearly in person. Even adjusting the contrast, the digital sensors failed to pick up the full outline. It wasn't just light and shadow, it was presence. It could be seen, but it refused to be captured. Cruz traced the curve of one shoulder with her gloved finger. The heat was gone, replaced with a cool energy like the air that wraps around a candle just after it's extinguished. Not lifeless, just paused. "We're not supposed to talk about this," Moretti murmured, almost to herself. "They erased the files, sanitized the report. If they knew we came back..." Cruz stood slowly and looked at her. "Then let them come." Her voice was firm now, not out of defiance but conviction. "If they won't tell the truth, we will." They sat across from the mark in silence for a long time. Neither one pulled out a notebook. No sketches, no measurements. They weren't here to document, they were here to witness. The tunnel, which had once been cold and industrial, now felt sacred like some hidden shrine buried under the chaos of a city that didn't know what it had paved over. At some point, the candle they'd left earlier burned out. Its stub sat quietly beside the wall, wax hardened into the cracks in the concrete. But even without its flame, the tunnel felt lit. Not in the physical sense, but in spirit. Like something was waiting for them to see it fully before it stepped forward again. Moretti knelt beside Cruz. "You think this is going to keep growing?" Cruz nodded. "If we keep showing up?" "Yeah, I do." Then, just as they stood to leave, they heard it again. That hum. Soft, low, but unmistakable. It rolled beneath their feet like a promise, a memory returning. And this time, it wasn't frightening. It was a welcome, a rhythm they now recognized. She hadn't left them. She was just waiting for them to return. Cruz didn't grow up religious, and neither did Moretti. They'd both stepped into churches for funerals, weddings, and the occasional city ceremony, but that was it. They weren't the praying kind. They were NYPD. They believed in reports, evidence, timelines. But ever since the tunnel, neither woman had slept the same. They weren't haunted, exactly. It wasn't fear, it was a pull. Like being called somewhere without knowing why, Cruz didn't know who else to turn to until she remembered a name from her mother's neighborhood in the Bronx. Father Mateo, an old priest, half retired, spent more time tending to his roses than to the parish these days. But there were stories about him, that he'd once worked closely with Vatican investigators, that he had been stationed in places where things happened that the church didn't put in books. Ghost stories whispered over soup kitchens, miracles that never made the news. They found him in a small parish near Arthur Avenue, sweeping dust from the pews himself. The church was quiet, worn, the air heavy with candle wax and wood polish. He looked up as they entered, his lined face still sharp beneath his graying beard. "Officers," he said with a nod. "What brings you to the forgotten corners of the city?" Cruz stepped forward. "We need to talk to someone who's seen, A, strange things, real things, not stories." He studied her face for a long moment, then motioned to a small office behind the altar. "Come," he said. "If you're looking for answers, you may not like all of them, but I won't lie." Inside, the room was dim, lit by a single lamp and the amber glow of a votive candle. Moretti sat across from him, quiet at first, until Cruz opened the small cloth she had wrapped around the metal. She placed it on his desk. Father Mateo's expression changed. He didn't touch it. He simply stared. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "In a tunnel," Cruz replied. "Under the Hudson, after a crash that should have killed us." His eyes narrowed. "And the woman?" Moretti looked up, surprised. "You know about her?" "I don't know your woman," Mateo said slowly. "But I know others like her. Stories that don't get told out loud. Men in war zones, seeing her on the battlefield. Miners trapped in tunnels, guided by a light they couldn't name. Prisoners who heard prayers and voices no one else could hear. She appears in places people are forgotten, places beneath the world." Cruz leaned in. "You think it was her? Mary?" He paused. "Maybe. Or something older than our names for her. Divine presence wears many forms. Some call her Mary, some call her Grace." He finally picked up the metal, cradling it gently. "This one was never made for tourists," he said. "This was blessed in fear, worn by people who knew they might die in the dark. The church doesn't give these out anymore, but they show up when they're needed." Moretti asked, "Why us?" He met her eyes. "Because you were meant to see her. Because something or someone wanted you to remember." They sat in silence as the candle flickered. Then Mateo said one final thing. "Whatever you saw, don't let the city bury it. The church doesn't always recognize the miraculous, but miracles don't wait for permission." Father Mateo didn't ask for details, but he gave them a name buried deep in the memory of the Bronx's older parishes. "Look for St. Delilah's," he had said. "It's not a church anymore, hasn't been for decades, but the foundations are still beneath the tunnel system." He spoke like someone who had seen the ground shift beneath sacred things too many times. They built over it when the Holland Tunnel was expanded in the 1930s. The city forgot, but she didn't. Cruz and Moretti weren't sure what they expected to find, but they tracked the old records, pieced together maps from city archives, and followed a crumbling thread of forgotten blueprints. The deeper they went, the more absurd it all felt. Two cops on their days off, chasing down rumors of a buried chapel beneath a modern tunnel. But every lead lined up. Every piece of the past whispered the same name, St. Delilah's. Eventually, they found it. Not through a front door, there was no longer an entrance in any directory. The path was roundabout, buried under maintenance routes and sewage lines. It took them to a forgotten corridor sealed off with rusted chain and padlock. They cut through it with borrowed tools, not quite sure if what they were doing was illegal. They didn't care, not anymore. Behind the chain was a narrow stairwell, carved into old stone. It didn't belong to the rest of the tunnel. The walls were wrong-arched, with faint etchings in languages neither of them could read. The air grew colder with each step, but it wasn't the cold of neglect. It was sacred, preserved. At the bottom, they found a single room, small, no more than 20 feet across. And at the far end, lit by a shaft of natural light that somehow filtered through layers of concrete, stood a worn statue. The Virgin Mary, head bowed, hands open. Robes that had once been blue now dulled by dust and soot, but still standing, still whole. Around her were remnants of offerings, old candles, crumbled photographs, rosaries decayed by time. Some looked nearly a century old, others far more recent. Moretti picked up a candle with a faded label. The wax was soft. "This was burned recently," she said. "Someone else knows about this place." Cruz approached the statue slowly. At the base was an inscription, barely legible. "She watches beneath the world. Light for those who descend in darkness." She knelt, hand brushing the floor, where prayer mats had once been placed. "This is where she came from," she whispered. "This is her place." They stood in silence for a long time. The walls were lined with alcoves, some collapsed, others intact. In one, they found a brass holder with slots for candles, 10 of them. Only one had been used recently. The rest sat waiting. Cruz lit another, not knowing why. Just knowing it felt right. The flame took instantly. No flicker, no hesitation. And then both women heard it. That hum. That familiar vibration. Soft, gentle, surrounding them like arms. And on the wall behind the statue, just faint enough to go unnoticed, unless you were already looking, was the same burn mark. The arms, the outline, the invitation. She hadn't appeared in the tunnel. She had come from beneath it. The next few days blurred into quiet obsession. Cruz and Moretti returned to St. Delilah's hidden shrine whenever their shifts allowed, sometimes just sitting in the old stone chamber, saying nothing. There were no more apparitions, no glowing woman in blue, but the place felt alive, like each prayer left behind by someone long gone had left a mark that time couldn't erase. Moretti took to researching the origins of the shrine, digging through old parish newsletters and immigrant-led Catholic society records from the 1920s and 30s. That's when the pieces began to connect. St. Delilah's had been built by Italian and Polish immigrants, many of whom worked construction on the early subway and tunnel systems. They were often poor, overworked, and forgotten by the city above. Accidents were common, injuries frequent, and deaths quietly buried under bricks and bureaucracy. But down in those dangerous spaces, they brought with them something stronger than cement: faith. Moretti read aloud from one of the scanned pages of a near illegible journal. "We pray to the Madonna under the streets. She watches, she warns, she walks with those who are buried." It wasn't metaphor. These workers had built an underground sanctuary not just as a place to pray, but as a lifeline, a protection, a holy presence hidden beneath a city that rarely cared if they lived or died. Rumors in the records spoke of workers seeing visions in the tunnels, women in blue guiding them away from cave-ins, apparitions kneeling beside injured men, whispering comfort as they died. Stories dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations, until the same things were recorded again and again. Cruz found a translated Polish entry from 1931 that chilled her. One man survived the fall because he stopped to light a candle. He said she was there, no one else saw her. But the collapse crushed the others. The parallels were too exact. The same presence, the same timing, and always the same result: someone spared in the exact moment they should have died. "Why don't people talk about this?" Moretti asked aloud. "Why bury it?" Cruz didn't answer at first. Then she said, "Because miracles don't come with permission slips. They don't fit neatly in reports. And most people don't want to believe that something holy could be hiding in the filth." They returned again that night with a candle for each of the 10 slots in the brass holder. One by one, they lit them, standing in silence. Cruz whispered something under her breath. Not a prayer, just a thank you. When the last candle was lit, the hum returned low, steady, surrounding them in a warmth that made the stone chamber feel like a chapel in sunlight. Then, something shifted. On the wall behind the statue, faint writing began to emerge. No fire, no scratching, just a slow darkening, like ink rising through old paper. 2 words. Still here. The air trembled. The candles flickered, but didn't go out. They stayed until the hum faded again, until the writing had sealed itself into the wall like a promise. She wasn't just a vision. She was history, memory, protection, passed down through generations of the forgotten. And she had never left. Cruz had spent her career learning how to move unseen. You didn't survive as a female officer in New York by drawing attention. You watched. You kept your voice even. You kept your badge clean, your record cleaner. You didn't talk about the panic attacks. You didn't mention the family you barely called. You didn't tell anyone when the job started to pull apart the seams of your soul. And Moretti? She didn't let anyone in. Not even Cruz. She was sharp, quick, fearless on the streets. But beneath the confidence was a silence no one asked about. Not until that night, sitting on the cold floor beneath the hidden shrine, did the words finally come. You know, Moretti said, her voice low, I wasn't supposed to be on that shift. Cruz turned. What do you mean? I was supposed to call out. I had a transfer packet half filled on my desk. I was ready to go. I didn't tell you because I didn't think I'd say yes. But that night, I was done. I was just going to disappear. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them along one of the old stone grooves. But then we went through that tunnel, and we saw her, and everything stopped. Cruz exhaled, letting the weight of that confession settle. I haven't talked to my mother in 6 years, she said. She prays the rosary every morning, sends me voicemails on Sundays. I never call her back. She looked down at the candle between them. The night of the crash, she lit a candle for me. Said she felt something coming. Said she asked Mary to watch over me. Neither spoke for a while. The chamber was silent. The air was still. But the heaviness that had haunted both of them since that night began to lift. You are seen. Those were the words the presence had spoken, not out loud, but inside them. And now, sitting in that forgotten chapel beneath the weight of 10 lit candles, they understood what it meant. It wasn't about being watched. It was about being known. Fully, deeply. Even in the darkest corners of their lives, when the city forgot them, when their families didn't understand them, when their uniforms became shields for pain, no one asked about she had seen them. Not as officers, not as survivors. As daughters, as women, as souls. Moretti wiped her eyes. I've never felt that before. Cruz nodded slowly. Me neither. They weren't religious. They still didn't have the words for what they saw. But they knew what it had done to them. How it had rearranged something inside. How it had opened a door they didn't know existed. She wasn't there to impress us, Cruz said quietly. She wasn't there to perform a miracle. No, Moretti whispered. She was just there. So we'd know we weren't alone. Outside, the city moved on. Horns blared. Subways rattled. Another siren screamed into the distance. But down here, beneath the noise and steel, 2 women sat in silence. Seen, held, changed. Neither of them spoke about it at first. They went back to work, took calls, filed reports, laughed at the squad room jokes. But something had shifted, and it wasn't just emotional. It was as if the tunnel had opened a door neither of them could close. Cruz started waking up at odd hours, heart racing, just seconds before the precinct phone would ring, with a call about a domestic dispute or a robbery in progress. Not often, but just enough to notice. Moretti, too, had changed. At first it was subtle, a moment of déjà vu so intense it left her breathless, a mental image of a suspect's face before turning a corner. Knowing what someone was about to say before they said it, she told herself it was coincidence, training, pattern recognition. But deep down, she knew better. These weren't guesses. They were glimpses. It was never flashy, never something you could show someone. Just knowing. As if the presence in the tunnel hadn't just saved them, it had left something behind. They didn't dare tell the others. Not at first. Not in a department where admitting you were seeing things, even true things, was a fast track to desk duty and psych evals. But they started keeping a journal, noting the dreams, the feelings, the timing. Cruz wrote down a dream of fire in an alley 2 nights before a warehouse blaze took out half a block. Moretti sketched a badge number she'd seen in her sleep, one belonging to a rookie cop who would later be pulled from the wreckage of a traffic collision after miraculously surviving a 10-car pileup. And always the same phrase would echo in their heads afterward. You are seen. It wasn't about visions or prophecy. It wasn't about magic. It was about connection, like they'd been tuned to a frequency few could hear. A frequency that whispered when things were about to break. When someone needed saving. When someone was standing one step from death. One night, after a call that ended peacefully because Cruz had just felt something was off, she looked at Moretti across the patrol car and said, Do you ever feel like we're being used? Moretti didn't hesitate. Not used. Trusted. Cruz nodded. That was exactly it. Whatever had happened in the tunnel wasn't about them. It was about what they were supposed to do next. They returned to the shrine quietly one evening with a new candle. Just one. Cruz placed it at the center and whispered, "We didn't ask for this." But then Moretti stepped forward, lit the candle, and said, "No, but we're going to use it." And something somewhere deep in the stone responded. A low hum, the air shifting ever so slightly, like breath, like approval. They didn't know how long it would last, or whether others had been given the same gift. But they knew now. Miracles didn't always come with trumpets and visions. Sometimes they came in quiet. Sometimes they came when no one else was watching. And sometimes they came as gifts you didn't ask for, but could never give back. There are places in the city where no one goes unless they have to. Places that live beneath the concrete, tucked between rusted pipes and forgotten history. The tunnel was one of those places, just a shortcut to most, a stretch of concrete between two worlds. But not to Cruz and Moretti, not anymore. They kept returning. Not every night, but regularly, quietly, anonymously. Sometimes to sit, sometimes to pray, though neither of them would have called it that. Sometimes just to listen. The world above never noticed, but the space beneath held their story like an old cathedral holds the scent of incense long after the smoke is gone. They never saw her again, not as they had that night. But there were moments when the hum returned, faint and low, like a heartbeat under stone. Moments when a flicker of light danced across the burn mark, even when no flame was present. Moments when the 10 candles lit in the brass holder burned longer than physics should allow. They started bringing others quietly. A retired officer who'd lost his daughter. A paramedic struggling after the collapse of her marriage. A subway maintenance worker who swore he saw a veiled woman walk the tracks late one night and hadn't been able to sleep since. Each came in silence. Each left with something wordless in their chest. Cruz and Moretti told no one in uniform. Not officially, but word still got out, whispers that the ghost tunnel had become a place to leave a candle if you were desperate, or dying, or needed something not found in any department manual. And sometimes, someone would report the strangest thing. A woman in blue, just standing, watching, never speaking. Sometimes in the tunnel, sometimes in dreams. They never tried to capture it again. No photos, no recordings, just memory, reverence, the understanding that not everything sacred can be owned. One day, the city would seal the place for good. That was inevitable. All things holy eventually get paved over by progress. But the two of them knew something no cement could hide. She didn't need a building. She didn't need a shrine. She didn't even need a name. Because she wasn't just a vision. She wasn't just history. She was an answer. To two women who were burned out and broken. To a tunnel the city forgot. To 100 years of whispered prayers from the underground faithful. She had appeared to save them. Not for who they were, but for who they still could be. And long after the memory faded from news headlines and official reports, candles still showed up in the dark, left by strangers, lit in silence, names unspoken, but seen, always seen.